Welcome to Intuitive Reactions, the MENA and Gulf Regions. This is number 45, and it will be quite a brief one today. 57 US lawmakers, roughly 1/4 of the Democrats in the House in Washington, D.C., sent a letter to US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and to the director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, in which they asked the US to initiate a probe, an examination, an investigation into the murder of Shereen Abu Aqleh, the Palestinian Al Jazeera journalist who was murdered in Jenin in the northern West Bank of Palestine. Now, why did the US lawmakers get involved? Well, in part because Shereen Abu Aqleh was not only a Palestinian journalist living in Beit Hanina in the northern suburb of Jerusalem, but because she also was a US citizen. And therefore, it is the duty of the United States to ensure that its citizens are protected, not wantonly murdered. Now, interestingly enough, the Israeli ambassador in the US, Ambassador Herzog, wrote a letter responding to this request for a probe, in which he basically said that this is not the right time and this is not the right approach or attitude, and that what should be done is for the Palestinians to hand over the bullet that killed Shereen Abu Aqleh to the Israelis so that they can have a joint investigation, I assume, Israelis and Palestinians, of this murder, and finally identify who had shot that bullet and who had killed Shereen. Now, it's very interesting on two levels. On level number one, you ask anybody, eyewitnesses. You ask Al Jazeera journalists who went and examined the site itself. You ask the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, and all of them would tell you that it is hugely unlikely that it was anything that involved Palestinians, and that this bullet will have been shot by an Israeli soldier. Now, of course, the question then would turn, if this were the case, was this done deliberately? Was it done in cold blood? Was it a murder that is wanton, or was this an accident? Now, interestingly enough, also, the request for a probe comes at the same time as the response by Ambassador Herzog, when we all know, you and I, that there is hardly any trust between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And I think it would be very foolhardy of the Palestinian Authority to deliver that bullet to the Israelis, because somehow it might well disappear or be misplaced, and therefore the one evidence of the killing of this 51-year-old woman would also disappear. So, given this standoff, what is the best solution? In my opinion, the best solution in this particular case, as Noura Arekat in an interview with CBS News said, and so many others have actually said it too, there should be an international probe, an international investigation, and there are many organizations that are equipped, that are qualified to undertake this investigation in order to identify the circumstances of the murder that took place in Jenin. But I personally believe that what has happened and all the noise around this murder and you have seen so many headlines. I'm sure you've watched the attack by the Israeli police on the pallbearers at the funeral of Shereen Abu Aqleh as the coffin was coming out of St. Joseph's French Hospital. And you have seen the way since then and before that, when so many Palestinians have been clobbered, have been hit, have been beaten, either by the Israeli army or police or by settlers on Palestinian land. The question that keeps coming round and round is one of impunity and one of arrogance. Now Israel says no Palestinian flags are allowed to be flown anyway, are allowed to be carried anyway. And that was one of the major issues they had with Shereen Abu Aqleh's funeral. Well, go back 20 years, 2 decades. There was another sign of the Palestinian cause, Faisal Husseini, from Orient House in Jerusalem. In that period, when the Oslo negotiations were still ongoing, he was probably one of the most famous Palestinian politicians in charge of the Jerusalem file. When he died and his funeral was held, Palestinian flags flew and were carried by the hordes of people who accompanied that coffin, that casket. There wasn't the same kind of malicious attacks against demonstrators. So not only has the Palestinian occupation endured for so many decades, but the Israeli response is becoming more and more arrogant. More and more impunity is being exercised as if it doesn't matter, as if it's really a question of Israel saying, fine, we are in an apartheid regime, we do what we want, we order and you obey. Well, that will never happen, as Palestinians have shown with the spirit they have, with the fight they have put against occupation of their lands for so many decades. So perhaps international powers, perhaps the European Union, the United States, the US administration, perhaps others, human rights organizations, would exercise more pressure, first, to keep the murder of Shereen Abu Aqleh alive in the consciousness of the world, and secondly, to make sure that this murder is not also forgotten. She's not the first person to be killed. She's not the last person probably to be killed, unfortunately. So the question is to sustain the pressure, and Al Jazeera has some of the resources to help do that alongside other organizations and countries in order to have an investigation to see why this woman, this middle-aged woman, who was a journalist, not even a demonstrator, doing her job and killed in such a wanton manner. And actually, it's very interesting, the image I'm using today, because in the posters behind me, you can see the image of Shereen Abu Aqleh with the press emblazoned on her chest. And of course, there is a cross there because she was also Christian. But the words there, Al-Kalima la tamut. It bids farewell to Shereen, that's fine, but it also adds Al-Kalima la tamut. What does it mean? In English, it translates as the word, the spoken word, the written word, doesn't die. And that's quite true, because eventually, in a situation of apartheid, as we've seen in South Africa and in other places, the word is actually stronger than the gun. I hope the world community will not sweep this murder under the carpet.